from thegeopolity.com. My name is Yusuf and I'm an analyst at the Geopolity. Now, today's topic is something that's been on the news a lot for the last 2-3 weeks. It's about the conflict in Israel at the moment. Now, this started first with the eviction of some residents in an area called Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. And it's now escalated into a full-blown war with the Israeli Defense Force and Hamas actually getting involved with their rockets. Now, the global response has been absolutely huge. And on the flip side, the media response and the response from the politicians has actually been very quiet. Now, in order to dissect this issue and make sense of it, we've got Geopolity founder Adnan Khan here to discuss this with us. How are you keeping, Adnan?
I'm good, Yusuf. I'm good. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I'm just trying to keep up with the news. It's quite difficult because there's always a new thing happening in this issue.
Yeah, there has. There's a lot of moving pieces, which hopefully we'll have a look at today.
Yep, definitely. So I guess the best place to start is, how did the current crisis start?
Okay, so if we take a bit of a timeline, really this recent uptick in violence, which is obviously now turned into a full-blown crisis, it starts with the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah, which is a small town in East Jerusalem. And what you've got here is you've got Zionist groups who are really looking to take over this area and really take over the whole of Jerusalem. So you've probably seen on the media, this town's been covered quite a lot. Quite a few media outlets have actually gone out to this town. And really where things kicked off was a video of a Zionist, and he's trying to kick out a resident. And he's actually saying to the resident that if he doesn't steal her home, somebody else will, which has really shocked people. So as these evictions are going on, I mean, I call them evictions. Really what these are is someone stealing your home and kicking you out. That's what's really going on here. So as a result, a number of protests started in this particular town. And then eventually people even started coming from surrounding towns to actually help the residents. So this was all near the end of Ramadan. So you'd have this really surreal scenario where on one side of the road, you got people protesting who then break their fast and they eat and they sit around a table on the street and then they pray. And then opposite them, you've got Zionists who have taken over a home and they're keeping a sturdy eye on these people. And then eventually it's going to kick off because things boil over. Now, as this was going on, Zionist police then began to attack the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is, very close to this village. So I'm sure we've all seen the images that have come out from Jerusalem, the use of rubber bullets, the use of skunk water, the violence. And then as this went on for a few days, eventually rocket attacks started from Gaza. And some of these have actually reached Tel Aviv. I think for a couple of days, the main international airport in Tel Aviv, the Ben Gurion airport, actually had to close down. And then eventually what we've seen is a full-on assault really on Gaza by Israeli Zionist forces. There's talk of an invasion, but it seems to be an incursion really into the border areas and launching of attacks. So we've seen, media outlets attacked, whole buildings brought down in the name of dealing with terrorism. So this is just a recent uptick in violence. The underlying issues of apartheid, colonization and occupation, they're still there. And, really this is just the recent iteration of this ongoing struggle.
Now, I just want to go into some of the points that you mentioned for the audience. You mentioned at the start that the Zionists, they're trying to actually take over all of Jerusalem. Is that fair to say? Is that something that is actually true? Where have you got that kind of view from?
So the 1967 war, they actually took over most of Jerusalem. The challenge the Zionist authorities have had is when they took it over, there was still a lot of residents there, a lot of Palestinian and Muslim residents. So what they've been trying to do is push them out through a number of tactics by making life very, very difficult, by not giving them permits. And then what you've seen for the last decade or so is Zionist organizations funded from abroad, especially America. They've been funding the clearing out of non-Jewish residents in this area. So this is actually well known. I mean, to be honest with you, the Israeli officials have not even denied this. They've not even addressed it at all. Because for them, it all starts from the rocket attacks from Gaza. What was happening before that, Sheikh Jarrah, al-Aqsa, they don't even make reference to that at all. And even Human Rights Watch in America just a month ago, even they addressed. In fact, what's taking place in Sheikh Jarrah is actually just one example of many of the same thing taking place across historic Palestine. So to be honest, there's actually lots of evidence and lots of examples out there, and even by neutral organizations, even by organizations who don't support any of the sides. So, that is just one problem amongst many that's taking place in that territory.
Okay. Now, obviously, Israel responded, some would say, in a very heavy-handed manner. What has led them to actually respond in this way?
So the Israeli response is nothing new. Israel's always responded in an extremely disproportionate and heavy-handed manner. I think we need to keep in mind that the Zionist authorities and the Zionists, they're an occupying force. And they are having to deal with millions of people who are resisting the colonization and their occupation. But what really seemed to have really ticked them off this time round, the Zionist authorities that is the fact that so many people turned up to defend the residents of Sheikh Jarrah. So many people came from across the West Bank to actually come and support them. So many people came to support them that the Israeli authorities actually shut down the roads that would bring them there. So people came on buses, people came on cars. So when the roads were shut down, they actually all went on foot. So this really ticked the Israeli authorities out. And really, once that happened, you see that they began starting to attack Al-Aqsa Mosque. And what they're really doing is, and what they're trying to show residents is that the Israeli authorities can stop anyone from coming to Al-Aqsa. So if you don't play ball, if you don't stop your protests, then they will stop you from coming to Al-Aqsa. So in effect, the residents, the non-Jewish residents or the non-Zionist residents in historic Palestine, they need to rely on Israel allowing them to come to the Holy Land. And if they don't play ball, Israel will not actually allow them. So Israel is trying to achieve all its goals of occupation via a military strategy, via apartheid and via oppression. And their strategy is really the same strategy the UK used in Northern Ireland, which ultimately failed in the end.
Now, why is it that Israel actually gets away with this type of tactic or strategy that they employ?
So the Zionists get away with this because they have spent decades working on building up support by protecting the interests of other nations. So Israel, it protects the interests of America. You could say it's the spear in America's armor. So by doing that role, America provides it with significant support. So as a result, the response in America has been very interesting. Joe Biden, for some reason, seems to have lost his tongue. He can't even come out and say and criticize even Israel. But however, he finds his tongue when it comes to criticizing the resistance. In fact, I think his response was that he feels the Israeli response has not been disproportionate at all. But interestingly, there's a lot of opposition in the US against what they've seen Israel's doing. Okay, this comes a lot from the left, but many people have been quite shocked of what they've seen by the Israeli authorities. So they're able to get away with it. And I think we've got to keep in mind that it was the West. It was Britain and America that created the Zionist entity. France, Germany, all these countries have supported it. Netanyahu and many presidents before him have openly said Israel the equivalent of an aircraft carrier for these countries in the Middle East. So as far as they're concerned, they're all in it together. Supporting the Zionist entity is a good return on investment for America. So that's why they're able to get away with this. But I think in the 21st century, in the era of social media, I mean, in mainstream media, we probably would never have seen that resident Sheikh Jarrah being told that if her property is not stolen by one Zionist, another one will come. We probably would never have seen that on mainstream media, but with the social media, we're seeing this sort of stuff. So, the Israeli propaganda machines actually struggled against the truth that many, many people are seeing.
Now, the international response, as expected, it was the same response that has always been the case the last few decades. The West supported Israel and claimed that Israel had a right to defend itself in this way. But over my lifetime anyway, I've not actually seen a response from the Muslim world quite like this. So, speaking to people, looking on social media again, across the Muslim world, you're finding more and more people are calling for some sort of Muslim military intervention. I don't know if that's something that you've sensed as well. Could you kind of give us some details about that?
Yeah, Yusuf, I sense the same thing. I mean, in my lifetime, I've been looking at the Middle East and this particular conflict for over 2 decades. And, we can officially say there's been a wholesale change in the Muslim response specifically. The calls for UN intervention, charity, and going to the international community, these are being completely drowned out by calls for a Muslim military response. And as I mentioned, many were just shocked at the attack on al-Aqsa during Ramadan. I mean, to give you a picture, it's the last 10 days of Ramadan, people are praying well into the night. People have been to al-Aqsa, even non-Muslims, and it's very peaceful. People are praying, they've broken their fasts. It's the last 10 days. You got a prayer atmosphere going on. And what you saw during this period was a very, very aggressive Israeli response. And let's not forget, al-Aqsa is holy land for Muslims. It's mentioned in the Quran, it's blessed land, yeah? And many have just come to the realization now that the international community have really for decades just strengthened the Zionist occupation. All these talks of peace really has just led to the Zionist entity expanding its settlements. So that's why it's not surprising that many in Jordan crossed over the border to help. Many within the militaries of Egypt, Turkey and Pakistan, they've posted videos on social media where they talk about this being a red line and how their militaries need to respond. So the oppression has got to such a point that some people just feel that every solution's failed, and really what you need is a response from the Muslims directly, which has to be a military response. So you're absolutely right. In my lifetime, I've never seen anything like this. I mean, even advocates of some sort of military response, that was always a marginal view and considered very, very unpractical. Absolutely not anymore. In fact, many of the leaders of the Muslim world, they've been busy tweeting and they've been busy condemning. And you're seeing people who are not particularly pro or against their leaders, they're coming out saying enough of tweets, enough of talk, we need to see action. And that has never happened before. So the rulers find themselves in a bit of a precarious situation, really. On the one side, there's their relationship with the US and the West. On the other side, they've got their people, and the sentiments of the people are on one side and the rulers are in a completely opposite direction. So they find themselves stuck between two completely divergent views, and these sort of things don't usually end well.
Yeah, I think the example of Jordan was actually, it shows that quite clearly, that how the civilians cross the border, however the politicians and the army kind of hold back. Now, on that point, if there's such a big split between the sentiments of the people compared to the action on and the response of the leaders, is it really a realistic thing that there would be a military response from the Muslim world? Is that a realistic thing, realistically going to happen? Could it tactically even be possible?
So I think there's really two things we've got to look at when we're looking at this. Is it realistic and is it tactically possible? When we're looking at it being realistic, that's a political issue. That politically, is there any political will by the Muslim rulers? And then tactically is really an issue of military capability. Politically, there's absolutely no will from the rulers. I mean, that's why Israel's still there today. Israel surrounded by, was it 350, 400 million people? They're just about 9 million people. The reason why it's still here today is because there's been absolutely no political will by the leaders. In fact, the leaders of the Muslim world have facilitated Israel's position in the region. So the end of the Trump term, we saw the normalization, the deal of the century. That's completely stalled now, because as leaders, you really want to go against the people. So absolutely, there's no political will. But the problem our rulers have got now, or the Muslim rulers have, is they are diametrically opposed to the sentiments of the people. And we saw what happened when the Soviet Union leaders were on the opposite side to their rulers. In fact, every revolution happens because the rulers are completely out of touch with the sentiment of the people. From a tactical perspective, you've got Turkey in the region, you've got Egypt, you've got Jordan, and any military response from these countries would completely complicate the Zionist entity's position. I mean, the Palestinians are using homemade rockets and stones. If they had arms, the whole situation completely changes. If there was a physical intervention by any of the regional armies, it completely changes the calculus. Israel struggles with the size of its population. I mean, just look at it like this. There is more people in the Egyptian army than there is in the population of Israel. So Israel will be completely overwhelmed if there was an intervention by any of the Muslim countries in the region. So tactically, absolutely it's possible. But as we know, war is just politics through other means. Politically, absolutely, the Muslim rulers really are in bed with the Zionist entity. They always have been. And that's why the Zionist entity is still there.
Now, let's say that some of these countries did respond militarily. A lot of people would say that response is miscalculated, that it would create more tension, and it could. There was even some people that saying it could lead to World War III. What are your views on that?
So, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, the war has already started. It started back in 1922, when the British used its mandate to facilitate Zionist settlers, who then in 1948 declared statehood over the homes of the indigenous people. So as far as the Palestinians are concerned, the war already started. I mean, for the war to get worse, they've lost their homes. They're homeless. I mean, most of Jordan's population are Palestinians who were expelled from their homes. So the situation for the Palestinians is already dire. So if you look at it, your line of question usually comes from pro-Zionist leanings, where we don't want things to get worse. Remember, the situation is worse for the Palestinians who've lost their homes, not for the Zionists. The Zionists are increasing their occupation. They're trying to increase their grip. It's the Palestinians who are actually struggling. So absolutely, war would be bad. Nobody wants war. But you got to remember that the Zionist entity was created in a situation of war. They had terrorist gangs who went around and took over towns and expelled the people from those towns. Yeah, some of them are still there. Many have moved. Well, they were forced really. They're living in refugee camps. So as far as the Palestinians are concerned, things are as bad as they can be. For things to get worse, well, they're already homeless. They're already technically stateless. And a lot of this really comes down to the Palestinian people being let down by the Muslim rulers in the region. Egypt has a peace treaty with Israel, which means the south of Israel isn't under threat. Jordan has its own peace treaty with Israel, which means the longest border Israel has is also secure. So really, if you look at it, it's actually the Muslim rulers who have actually facilitated the Zionist entity. But as I said, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, the situation is already bad. I mean, how much more bad can it get? They lose even more of their homes.
Now, you mentioned historically what had happened was that the Zionists had their gangs and they would take over towns. Obviously, this started because the Zionists had a particular view that they are entitled to their homeland, and the area of Israel is something which was promised to them. It's the promised land. Can you give us some more thoughts and some points about that? Is that actually something true? What do you think?
So you're right. You mentioned a few things there which make up the Zionist narrative, that Jews are persecuted people. They have a right over Israel because that's their land. They've lived there for thousands of years, and even the Bible's promised it to them. So I think there's a couple of things we need to make clear first. That, look, people live in places. Yeah, people don't live in thin air. They don't live in the shadow. They live in places. So people come together, and that's how you form a society. And this is just human nature. People may come together with people who are similar to them, similar in language. They become a society. They become a nation. Or you may have people with different beliefs who come together, and they all live together. But this argument that the Jews have a homeland, there are many people in the world that don't have a homeland. They don't even have their own state. So there are more Tamils in the world than there are Jews. They don't have their own homeland. The Kurds don't actually have their own nation. So this isn't unique. The Zionists are not unique in this. And for most of history, Jewish history, Jews were subsumed into other societies. They lived under Alexander the Great. They lived under the Romans. For 1,000 years, they lived with Muslims. So, this argument that they deserve a homeland, the issue here is everybody needs a home. But should you receive a home by expelling a people who are already resident there? So if you look at America, you had the indigenous Red Indians who basically received a genocide in order for European settlers to actually move in. And I think another point that's very important here is Palestine for around a millennia up to the 20th century was a homeland for the Jews, the Muslims and Christians. Muslim, Jews and Christians lived side by side in Palestine. The scenario we've got here is European Jews in the 20th century, or what they call the Ashkenazi Jews. They were the ones who advocated colonizing the Holy Land and actually moving there. So Jews already lived there in Palestine, although they were very small in number. We've got a claim here by European Jews who advocated that they need to colonize the Holy Land. So the issue here is that Zionists want to make Palestine exclusively for Jews. So what they've done is in the meantime, they've established an apartheid state. And this is the cause of all the problems. And that's the problem with a lot of their claims just don't add up to scrutiny. Even the argument that the Jews have been there for 2,000 years, they actually haven't. In fact, the Jews have only lived in historic Palestine for a couple of hundred years. The Egyptians, the Canaanites have been there for thousands of years. The Persians were there for thousands of years. The Muslims have been there for a millennia as well. So even that argument doesn't stand up as well. So the final argument they usually fall back on is the Bible. And this is really interesting because Israel's supposed to be a secular state, but their argument is a religious argument. Now the thing here is anybody could write a book and give themselves ownership of anything. And the Bible makes many, many claims about certain rights and certain things, but nobody argues that. So really, a lot of their arguments, historical arguments, are very inaccurate. I mean, Netanyahu says this all the time that the Zionists have a right to Palestine. It's their historic homeland. Well, for most of Jewish history, it's not been your homeland.
Now, you've got now two people claiming ownership of this land. And I think for the past 2 or 3 decades, the main solution that's been proposed is this idea of a two-state solution. How come that's not worked? Is this still a viable solution for the future?
So the two-state solution hasn't worked. Well, it's only one reason. It's the Zionists want to take over the whole of historic Palestine. So the two-state solution will only work if America imposes it on the territory and imposes it on the Zionists. But it's not the Palestinians that are expanding their grip, it's the Zionists who are expanding their grip. So what happens is the West Bank and Gaza are supposed to be the Palestinian state, and then the remainder of historic Palestine becomes Israel. But what the Zionist entity has been doing is been expanding settlements, and some settlements have been there for a couple of decades. So their argument is you can't build a Palestinian state in some of these territories because Jewish communities have been living there for decades. So really, the stalling of the two-state solution, it all fundamentally comes down to the Zionist entity. So you've seen it in the last couple of weeks. What's going on in Jerusalem? What you've got in Jerusalem is you've got evictions going on. You've got a legal system that prejudices against Palestinians and favours Zionists. So really, that's the problem. That's why the two-state solution isn't working. Now, the reason why America hasn't imposed it is because America's been busy for 2 decades in 2 wars. The Palestinian issue has been the last thing on its mind. So during that time, you see the Zionist entity has been expanding its territory and its hold on the issue as well. And just as a final point, a two-state solution doesn't mean you have an Israeli state and you have a Palestinian independent state. Because Israel has made very clear, which we saw come out during the deal of the century discussions, that the Palestinian state will have no military, but the last thing the Zionists want is Palestinians with heavy weapons. Even the police force of a Palestinian state will be integrated into the Israeli police because they don't want them to actually have weapons. So really the two-state solution is not an independent Palestinian state. Really it's just another prison really. It's an open prison. So really this two-state solution is originally a British UN proposal, which eventually America took up, and the West see this as the way to solve the issue, the fact that two different peoples want to live on that territory. But keep in mind that less than 100 years ago, well, about 70 odd years ago, there was no problem here. 70 years ago, you had Muslims, Jews and Christians living side by side.
Now, you said that the main obstacle for the two-state solution is Israel. However, Israel would claim that it's actually Hamas, and they are the main obstacle for peace, and much of the resistance that Hamas is actually creating is part of a more wider terrorist organization. Is that true?
So Hamas came into being in the 1980s, yeah, near the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, when the first Intifada started, yeah, and the Intifada is an uprising by the people who were being oppressed. So Hamas didn't exist in 1948. It didn't exist in the 50s, 60s, 70s at all. It came well later. So I think when the Zionists claim that Hamas is the problem, or Hamas is a natural emergence, or resistance is a natural thing that will take place when people are being oppressed. Now, if terrorism is the use of violence to achieve your political goals, well, that definition clearly fits the Zionist entity Israel. They are using their military, they're using their tanks, they're using their fighter jets, they're using missiles, they're using their prejudice system to impose on the people. That is the exact definition. So really, you know, Hamas and all the resistance is a reaction to this. I mean, people were kicked off their lands. The Zionist entity is expanding settlements, it's creating an apartheid system. You're going to get resistance. It's going to happen. Now, I don't necessarily condone all the actions Hamas do. However, the argument here is that the Israeli state is different to Hamas. Hamas actively carry out attacks and Israel doesn't. Not really. There's actually no difference between the two. Hamas carries out attacks and it has a reason for this, and the Israelis carry out attacks and they have a reason for this. And we're not even talking here about the validity of their reasoning. The Israeli claim is they're defending themselves, but really they're expanding their colonization of the territory. Hamas at the most, yeah, are actually defending their territory, even though they're democratically elected. And we've got to keep in mind, Hamas have accepted the two-state solution. The Zionist entity hasn't, because they keep refusing to agree to any drawing of a permanent border, and they keep building settlements. Hamas have on multiple times agreed to the two-state solution. So this is why in the previous question, my argument that it's the Israeli state that stands in the way of the two-state solution, it's actually not Hamas, it's actually not even Fatah. Both these groups agree to this two-state solution. But what you've got here is a grand vision by the Zionists to take over the whole territory and expel the indigenous people.
Now, a lot of Israelis would argue that the reason why Israel needs to act in this way is because many Palestinians actually want to wipe Israel off the map.
Yeah, so this is a common argument. Apparently, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad of Iran, he said this, and Hamas have said that. But if you go to downtown Tel Aviv, Israeli citizens say the same thing about Palestinians. They're talking about a genocide. When Al-Aqsa was being attacked, the Zionists were celebrating the 1967 war. There's been parties to celebrate the attack on towns, Muslim towns or Palestinian towns. So the Zionists say the same thing about the Muslims. They say the same thing about the Palestinians. You got some Zionists, right-wing Zionists, who've got ambition to take over the whole region. So this is quite funny coming from Zionists when they actually say the same thing about the Palestinians. The difference there is when Palestinians say this, they have absolutely no capability to implement it. When the Zionists say similar genocidal things about Palestinians, they don't just have the capability, according to many people, including Human Rights Watch, they're actually executing it at the moment as well.
Now, this conflict has been going on for decades, and there's a lot of involvement from international community. One question I had is, why is it that Israel has so much support from the West? What's their interest in supporting Israel and maintaining it?
So Israel was a British creation, and this was really during World War One and just after World War One. And what Britain was doing at the time was it was carving up the Middle East, it was carving up the Muslim world, it was carving up the Ottoman territories. So many countries, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Jordan, Kuwait, Iraq, all these countries came into existence after World War One. So Britain created the Zionist entity and many of the territories in the region in order to strengthen its position. It was rewarding some of its allies, the monarchy in Egypt, in Transjordan at the time, in Iraq. These are all people collaborated with Britain against the Ottomans. And what happened after World War II was Britain declined the power and America took over the baton of utilizing Israel. So Netanyahu has said on many, many occasions that Israel is the equivalent of an aircraft carrier for America in the Middle East. So he's effectively saying, arm us, keep funding us, and we will protect your interests in the region. And if you think about it, it's a good return on investment from a purely political perspective. You've got a foreign entity, it protects your interests, it keeps the region busy, it creates a balance of power in the region. If anyone in the region tries to dominate it, Israel will stand in the way, and that protects American interests. So that's why they've always supported it. So you've seen even in this particular last couple of weeks, France, Britain and America have openly come out and supported the Zionist entity. So Israel protects and supports and is a spear in the foreign policy of America specifically and the West in general. And that's why they will arm it, they will fund it, and they will support it.
Now, on the flip side, you have some nations, organizations supporting the Palestinians, such as Iran. And although we've not heard about them much in the news this time, the likes of Hezbollah in Lebanon. What's their interest and how do they want to actually, what's their interest in supporting Palestine and how do they see this support actually manifesting?
So for Iran, Palestine is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. Palestine is a way to remain relevant in the region. It's a way to gain support from Palestinians in the region. But for the Iranian regime, it is purely to use an issue which affects Israel in order that Iran becomes a dominant power in the region. So as Israel is struggling with Palestine, by supporting the Palestinians, this keeps Israel bogged down and it weakens them to some degree. And the reason why Iran does this, it has the ambition to be the regional power. So it sees Israel as competition. It sees Israel as the opposition. In the same way, it sees Saudi Arabia as the opposition. So because the Palestinian issue is at the center of the Muslim world, Iran took up the mantle of defending the Palestinians. So as a result, many people saw Iran in very good light because they were defending a Muslim issue. They were defending something that was at the heart of the Muslim world. But the problem Iran had was so did Turkey, so did Saudi Arabia, so did many other countries. So as a result, eventually Iran established Hezbollah in Lebanon in order to gain influence there, and again on the northern border of Israel as well. But as you can see, for Iran, Palestine is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, and we saw this on this occasion. Iran is currently would be the best time to launch attacks from the north. It'll be the best time for Hezbollah to launch attacks from the north when Israel's struggling with the south of historic Palestine in Gaza and in Jerusalem. But they're not doing this. Why? Because they're in talks with America at the moment and they don't want to scupper them. In fact, Hezbollah, who's historically hurt Israel, have not even taken advantage of this political opening. And that's because Hezbollah really is an extension of Iran. And for Iran, it doesn't suit its interests. Iran wants a nuclear deal with America. And if it was to move on the Israeli issue now, it would completely scupper those talks altogether. And that's why, I mean, for Iran, Palestine is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. It's really a tool they use to achieve other goals. So that's why they're not actually interested in liberation for Palestine, although they want the credibility for that and they want the support of the Muslim world for that as well.
Where do you actually see this conflict going in the future? Do you see any end to it?
No, to be honest, it will just get worse because the Zionists want to expel all non-Jews. So that's going to cause tension in the region. And as we've seen with this conflict, the Muslim world is very united on this. You know, they want to see military action to reverse the occupation. The only thing standing in the way is the rulers of these countries. So the rulers are completely out of line, completely out of touch, completely in opposite direction to the sentiments of the people. And something's got to give. This is the direction things are going. In fact, in many ways, I mean, we'll have to see how it pans out. But what the Zionist entity's done now may have actually laid the seeds for the end in the long run as well. Because what they've done is they've unified the Muslims. They've unified the Muslim voice. In fact, there's two voices. There's the Muslim leaders who are voiceless all of a sudden. And then you've got the Muslim masses who want to see action. So really, Israel may have actually created the very seeds which causes its main problems down the line.
Okay, Adnan, I'm reading right now that Israel and Hamas have agreed to a ceasefire to end 11 days of violence. What's your take on that? Will it last?
Okay, so that's interesting. I think this has been in the works for a few days now. I mean, Israel's even alluded to it. Hamas have actually openly said it. In fact, Hamas actually reached out to the Zionist entity before the Gaza operation. And they said that let's agree a ceasefire on a mutual basis. But at that time, Netanyahu said no, because we need to teach you a lesson. Israel has a right to respond. And you could see the pressure was building that this isn't going to be permanent. Eventually, there's going to have to be some sort of a ceasefire. So obviously, a ceasefire is a temporary halt of hostilities. The underlying issues, as I've mentioned, of apartheid, colonization, and occupation, they're obviously not going to be part of the ceasefire. So the underlying issues aren't going to get resolved. But what we're probably seeing now is the beginning and the end of the current uptick in violence that actually happened. The residents of Sheikh Jarrah, that's probably going to continue. The further expansion of occupation into Jerusalem is probably going to continue. And in a couple of weeks, when people's attention's elsewhere, the Zionist entity will continue doing what it's always been doing until the next round it happens again. I wish I could give a more optimistic note, but I must say we've been here many, many times before. In fact, you know, this whole Sheikh Jarrah issue is really just a recent incarnation of the underlying problem that we've seen in that region. So, you know, it's good to hear that there's been some sort of ceasefire, but a ceasefire just ceases hostilities that were taking place currently. It doesn't really address any of the more underlying issues.
Okay, thank you for your time, Adnan, today. You helped us unpack a very complex issue. If you want to learn more about the issues raised today, please check out our website, www.thegeopolity.com, all one word. You can also learn more on other issues by accessing our website, where you'll find comprehensive insights on other topics. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.